All right, it is 10 a.m., so we shall start. My name is Andrea Botazato. I'm assistant professor and Enology extension specialist with Texas A&M, Texas Agrilife Extension Services. And this webinar is part of the Enology webinar series that we created here. The topic today is malolactic fermentation, and the presenter today is Ms. Denise Gardner. Ms. Gardner graduated from Penn State's Food Science program with a minor in horticulture in 2007 and earned her Master of Science in Food Science and Technology with an emphasis in Enology from Virginia Tech in 2009. Following graduate school, she worked in Napa as an artist Vinquery's sensory scientist, assisting wineries with specific wine sensory studies and conducting in-house evaluations on enological products. After returning to the eastern U.S., Denise was employed by Penn State Extension and focused on wine quality education, covering topics such as sensory evaluation, fermentation nutrition, good sanitation practices, and wine chemistry concepts. In 2013, Denise obtained the Certificate Specialist of Wines accreditation from the Society of Wine Educators and earned her Level 3 certification from the Wine and Spirit Education Trust, WSET, in 2015. In 2017, she became the chair for the American Society of Enology and Viticulture Eastern Section Organization, which focuses on providing current and research-driven information to the regional wine industry and providing scholarships for students studying viticulture and enology. In the fall of 2017, Denise Gardner launched a proactive wine consulting service, Denise Gardner Winemaking LLC. And its mission is to enhance a winery's production techniques and quality while providing winemakers and industry professionals with educational tools for their own individual growth. Now, before I hand it over to Denise, I just wanted to say that this session is being recorded and the presentation will be posted on YouTube. And I also ask you, if you have any questions, to hold them until the end of the presentation. We will have about 10 minutes for question and answers at the end, and we'll be happy to answer your questions then. And with that being said, Denise, thank you for being here today. And please, you're welcome to start your presentation.
Thank you. Thank you so much for inviting me to speak on this topic. I'm really happy to. The title of the presentation, Unlocking the MLF Toolbox, is really challenging, I guess, all attendees to start thinking about malolactic fermentation more as its own individual set of tools, as opposed to just looking at it from a deacidification standpoint. So hopefully by the end of the presentation, everyone will get a little bit of a better idea about the influence of malolactic fermentation and how it can be used for various reasons within wine production. And oh, I'm sorry, it wasn't changing. There we go. So if we look at this picture here, I always like to start with this when we talk about malolactic fermentation with the question of what do these two things have to do with wine? And obviously most winemakers would know that this is a depiction of the two different acids that are involved in malolactic fermentation. So on your left, you see the apple there. Apples are very high in malic acid, whereas the milk on the right has a very high concentration of lactic acid. And of course, malolactic fermentation, the process that we go through in winemaking, converts the malic acid to the lactic acid by the end of, by the completion of malolactic fermentation. So the reason why I like to show this depiction is because if you are struggling in figuring out what those different acids taste like and how sharp or soft they may be on your palate, these are really good places to start in terms of trying from a sensory perspective and focusing on the acidity, focusing on how much your mouth salivates after eating each individual item. Because the more salivation that you experience, the harsher that acidity really is. So of course, we're going to focus on these two acids and how that plays a role in malolactic fermentation. Hopefully by the end of this presentation, we'll go through which microbes or microorganisms conduct the malolactic fermentation process, the different time points in which you can utilize MLF during wine production, and then how malolactic fermentation alters more than just the deacidification process, than just changing this acidity that we talk about so regularly in the wine industry. If we look at acid management as a toolbox in and of itself, there are obviously so many different ways that we can adjust acid in wine. Malolactic fermentation is just one of those tools. But there's other things we could do, such as making juice acid adjustments, going through primary fermentation. I'm going to show you a study that shows the depletion of malic acid and a change in pH and TA, obviously, just from going through primary fermentation. And then, of course, after the wine is fermented, there's different ways we can adjust acidity as well, either through acid adjustments, blending, and sometimes even product additions can influence, maybe not so much the acid content, but it can influence the perception of the acidity in wine. If we switch gears and say, but instead malolactic fermentation itself is a toolbox, it offers more than just this acid management tool. It can actually contribute to a lot of other factors in wine, including changes in red wine color, changes in the aroma and flavor of the wine, which will ultimately influence complexity and wine style for the wine as well. So let's start with what is malolactic fermentation. Essentially, this is a biological conversion of malic acid, which is the chemical structure there on your left, to lactic acid, the chemical structure on your right. Now, why do we call it a biological deacidification process? It's simply because of those little blue circles there, chains there in the center of your screen, which is supposed to represent lactic acid bacteria. It's because this bacteria is actually converting the acid itself. And then through the consumption and utilization of malic acid, we actually lose this one carboxyl group here to get that lactic acid structure. And the loss of that carboxyl group, the COOH, ends up leaving the wine as carbon dioxide. So of course, this change in acidity, like I keep saying, it changes the acidity to some degree, which we'll cover a little bit more, but just realize that through this diagram here, it's also doing a number of other things as well. So I wanted just to take a small sideline and just note here that even if you're not using malolactic fermentation for whatever reason it may be, a recent study in 2013 actually showed that most commercial wine yeasts actually consume malic acid as well. And so you'll see this degradation of malic acid even after primary fermentation. The study showed that the percent of malic acid that was consumed or reduced ranged anywhere from 6.8 to 40%. So that's almost half of the malic acid for some of these strains, with the one that consuming 40% of the malic acid being the Burgundy yeast from Lallemand. But there were other commercial yeasts in that study that consume 30% or more malic acid, which is pretty significant if you really stop to think about that. So that includes everything from S377, Premier, L2226, Epernay 2, ICV D47, CSM 71B, and Uvaferm 43. These were all significantly reducing the malic acid concentration just from primary fermentation. So I bring this up just to say, if your goal is to retain as much malic acid as possible, then probably you may want to avoid some of these yeasts that have higher consumption rates of malic acid, because obviously the consumption of malic acid during primary fermentation is ultimately going to end up altering the mouthfeel of your wine and altering the pH and TA of the wine as well. Which leads me to this point. So when we go through malolactic fermentation, we typically have this increase in pH because we're changing the chemical structures of the malic acid to lactic acid. And this increase in pH is significant because it affects wine stability. So anytime we alter pH, there's going to be this secondary effect of stability in the wine. So what do I mean by that? That means pH has an influence over a lot of different chemical and microbiological factors in the wine. This includes color, the chemical chemical charge of tannins or proteins, different ions in the wine. Tartrate stability is influenced by pH, protein stability, sulfur dioxide stability, and then finally the biological stability. So biological stability being which microorganisms in your wine may proliferate over others at that given pH. So that's a pretty significant thing to take on. When we go through malolactic fermentation, we know there's going to be this change in pH, which is ultimately going to affect how we look at these different stability processes from that point forward. The other thing that typically happens during malolactic fermentation, because we are changing the chemical structure of the acid, is this decrease in TA. So the decrease in TA is important because this is what ultimately is perceived as sourness for consumers. So that direct change from having a sharp malic-driven wine to this softer, maybe rounder wine by the end of malolactic fermentation is pretty much related to this change in titratable acidity. There's two ways that winemakers can undergo malolactic fermentation. The first is obviously through spontaneous or native fermentation, and then the second being an inoculated or controlled fermentation. So with spontaneous or native fermentations, this is basically just allowing any lactic acid bacteria species, or I've abbreviated it here as LAB, to go ahead and consume the malic acid in your wine at whatever time and in whatever way that best serves them. So this is a fairly unpredictable process, right? You're leaving it up to the native populations of lactic acid bacteria on your grapes or that have been collected somewhere in your winery. You don't really know when malolactic fermentation is going to start, nor when it's going to end. The flavor influences are unpredictable because there's a wide range of secondary flavors that come from the malolactic fermentation process. So this can range anywhere from enhancing fruity flavors in your wine to enhancing vegetative flavors, which may not be desirable for some wines, and other flavors that some lactic acid bacteria species can produce are generally not considered desirable. These can range from anything from unfortunately, one of the descriptors being poopy diapers, and I've smelled wines that have that lactic acid bacteria spoilage type of flavor, but it's not a desirable attribute in most wines that we produce. It can also have effects on volatile phenols, those things we typically associate with Brettanomyces, volatile acidity, and even different mouthfeel structures that may also have a taste. And usually when I think of this, I'm thinking of ropiness or mousiness, where you get two different mouthfeel attributes that are obviously changing the flavor and perception of the wine and ultimately the wine quality. So when you're going through a spontaneous or native malolactic fermentation, and this is especially true if you don't have a really good idea of what species are dominating your winery, there is this unpredictability part of that process. On the flip side, when you do an inoculated or controlled malolactic fermentation, almost always you're going to be inoculating with Enococcus eni or O. eni. And this is because this is the lactic acid bacteria strain of choice for commercial replication and reproduction. The reason for this is because it is a fairly predictable strain. It's a little bit more resistant to different environmental factors within your wine. And in this case, when you are inoculating, you as the winemaker have control over the timing. You have a better predictable flavor outcome. So now there are strains where you can select for high diacetyl or that buttery perception versus low or even no diacetyl flavor perception by the time malolactic fermentation is completed. And so with this controlled concept, you also get more consistent wine quality because you're just in control of where that process is going. And you know which strain is ultimately completing your process or assumed to be completing your process. So when I talk about these lactic acid bacteria strains that contribute to malolactic fermentation, they generally have all of these same properties, or they do have all these same properties, which is why they're grouped into this group. Essentially, they're gram-positive bacteria, so they have a thick cell membrane that can retain that red-violet stain. They're non-mobile bacteria, so they don't like swim through the line. They pretty much just hang out in one location and do their thing. And that's just a property of the bacteria. They're non-sporulating, so they're not producing any spores, and they're considered facultative anaerobes. So in this case, while lactic acid bacteria can survive in oxygenated and non-oxygenated environments, they typically prefer the lower oxygenated environment, so not having oxygen readily available to them. This is important because if you are really paying attention to your wines, you know that all or most of the other spoilage organisms, by the time you would be going through malolactic fermentation, all require oxygen. So if you can minimize that oxygen, you can minimize spoilage and actually fuel the production of your malolactic bacteria, assuming that you have other ideal growth conditions like temperature and nutrients. And you can see here, lactic acid bacteria prefer a little bit of a warmer temperature, 68 to 86 degrees Fahrenheit. This isn't ideal from a winemaking standpoint because almost all the other spoilage microorganisms also prefer that temperature. So that's where the lack of oxygen can really come into play, because you can better create an environment for the growth and survival of your malolactic bacteria as opposed to your spoilage bacteria like acetic acid bacteria. In general, there's three different genera that we talk about in relation to malolactic bacteria, and that's Lactobacillus, Enococcus, and Pediococcus. For the most part, I don't know too many people that like to inoculate with Pediococcus. It's typically considered spoilage, but you will see various strains of Lactobacillus and Enococcus, of course, for the utilization of malolactic fermentation. These microorganisms do come in from the vineyard. They're found naturally on the grapes. However, most research has shown that these bacteria come in very low numbers compared to native yeast and native acetic acid bacteria. So you're not getting a really large population of bacteria to start. And in this situation, when you do bring in native lactic acid bacteria, it's almost always dominated by the Lactobacillus strains. So this is a different genre of bacteria compared to what we would use for inoculation, which is Enococcus. Typically with native strains, they do have a lot of environmental sensitivities. So one of those environmental sensitivities would be something like pH. If your fruit coming in from the vineyard is a really low pH, which I know we deal with here in the East, not so sure in Texas, but the low pH could shock that lactic acid bacteria and inhibit it from being able to grow. Another situation would be the higher pH, in which that may help fuel your lactic acid bacteria growth. And here I would mean high pH above 3.5. But that higher pH will allow growth of any of the lactic acid bacteria to grow, whether it's Lactobacillus, Enococcus, or Pediococcus. So you still have that risk there of proliferating the growth and survival of some spoilage lactobacillus as well. Other environmental sensitivities include things like the production of alcohol. Some of them are more sensitive to alcohol than others. Temperature is a big one. If it gets too cold, they likely will not grow. And those tend to be the big factors. Nutrient availability is another one, and we'll talk a little bit about that in later in the presentation. Comparatively, the commercial lactic acid bacteria strains, like I said, are almost always Enococcus, and this is because they are more reliable in wine environments being with the presence of alcohol. They tend to have more consistent growth and a more consistent outcome of utilizing malic acid during the malolactic fermentation process. They are also more tolerant of those low pH conditions, which is important for some wines, and also ciders, which I'll mention here at the end. And they do have a more consistent and maybe more optimal flavor influence, including, you know, lack of those off flavors, those undesirable characteristics we may not want. And then depending on the style and depending on the strain of Enococcus that you select, that diacetyl or buttery flavor. But there are some disadvantages to commercially inoculated malolactic fermentations, and the big one here is really the loss of red wine color intensity. This has been noticed in research for quite some time. You can find it pretty well documented in textbooks, and it's still pretty well heavily studied to this day. So going through malolactic fermentation does tend to give you this secondary effect in red wines where you will lose some color intensity. Most of the color intensity studies today are done on Pinot Noir because Pinot Noir lacks color intensity to begin with. And then, of course, undergoing malolactic fermentation can obviously cause more harm to that situation. So this first study here, you know, it definitely showed that the speed of malolactic fermentation reduced the color intensity of Pinot Noir. This is important because from a logistical and maybe business perspective in the wine industry, our goal is to go through these processes as quick as possible, get the wine process as quickly as possible and to the point of sale to make some money back on your investment. However, if we look at malolactic fermentation maybe more from a historical perspective, this was a process that wasn't very well controlled, and it wasn't uncommon for wines to go through malolactic fermentation in stages. So in some European districts, it may take 2 or 3 years before malolactic fermentation was complete. It may not have actually completed in that first year. And typically, we all know those stories where malolactic fermentation would take off when it was warm, and then when it was cold, the wine would sit again, and then it would take off again when it was warm the next year. And so that longer duration of time seems to have some sort of influence on the color overall. The second study here is a little more recent, and this is from Osborne's lab in Portland. In Oregon. And this was looking at the color loss in Merlot and Pinot Noir, regardless of the MLF inoculated strain and at the time that they were inoculating it. So I put this in here again because I think it's important because they were looking at a bunch of different commercial strains and not finding any difference in color retention. And so that should immediately make you think, okay, if I use a commercial strain, I'm probably going to find some color loss in my red wine. The interesting part, I mean, there's other interesting parts of this study, but the first one being that they all showed this reduction in color to the control. And in this case, the control was the Pinot Noir or the Merlot, whichever group it was, that did not go through malolactic fermentation. But they also had an altered pH control, meaning they took the wine and they didn't allow it to go through malolactic fermentation, but they manually altered the acidity to be reflective of the end pH of the wine if it had gone through malolactic fermentation. And interestingly enough in this study is that there was no significant difference between the real control and the pH altered control. So this really led to this fundamental question of, is color stability and color intensity, is it strictly related to the pH? Because that's always kind of been an underlying assumption that some of this loss of red wine color associated with malolactic fermentation was related to the change in pH. And so this study kind of made us think, or made the wine community think, is it possible that it's not pH related? And the other big outcome from this study was the concentration of polymeric pigment. These are your stable red color pigments that aren't affected by sulfur dioxide additions. The concentration of these components was lower in wines that had undergone malolactic fermentation. So that's not typically something you want to see because you obviously want the more stable red wine pigments if you're making red wines. Another issue with commercial and even native malolactic fermentation is really this issue of malolactic fermentation getting stuck. And so dryness in this case, is usually considered about 0.3 grams per liter of malic acid or 300 milligrams per liter of malic acid. And it's pretty essential that to measure that to see if you are actually at that point, because it's not uncommon for malolactic fermentations to stop for whatever reason they may want to. And then once you've gone through and bottled the wines, maybe they'll restart again. It's always a possibility. And so when you have these situations where you are getting stuck, there's a number of things that you can do, including adjusting the wine temperature. This is usually the very first thing that anyone's going to recommend to you because they do need that warmer temperature. Removing wine off the lees or just moving the wine in general, sometimes that lees can pull out nutrients that are essential for the malolactic bacteria to continue their growth. It's another solution. There may be a addition of an MLB nutrient. You may have just run out of nutrient that they need for their growth and survival. Oftentimes when you're working with somebody, it's usually recommended you do some analytical testing. The reason for this is to really get a scope of what's happening in your wine. And of course, ensure that the MLF is complete, which is usually done through analytical testing as well. So the analytical testing that may be recommended that you do to figure out why your MLF is stuck could range from all of these to a combination of these. And again, this is really just to try to pinpoint the reasoning behind why your malolactic fermentation is stuck. Now, those of you that registered for today's webinar, I did include, I guess, my list that I provide for my clients with a number of different things and some dosage rates of different things in terms of what to do if you do get a stuck malolactic fermentation. So that goes into a little bit more detail than what I have here. But hopefully you can all use it, and it'll be helpful if you ever do run into this situation. So let's switch gears a little bit from some problems with malolactic fermentation to timing. So when do you actually inoculate, assuming you are going to inoculate for malolactic fermentation? To be quite honest, this is really a stylistic decision. It's almost always based on the preference of the winemaker or based on logistical concerns. There is no standard in terms of when you should be inoculating for malolactic fermentation. It is simply stylistic. You're not going to get a one case fits all recommendation either whenever you inoculate. It's really, really up to you. So there's a bunch of different times you can inoculate. The first would be during a simultaneous inoculation or a co-inoculation with your wine yeast. So this would be literally when you are pitching the yeast, you are also pitching the malolactic bacteria. So they're happening at the same exact time. More often than not, you'll see the term co-inoculation used in the literature incorrectly, including myself. I often use it incorrectly to mean co-fermentation. So the difference here is a co-fermentation would be when you pitch the yeast, and then anytime thereafter pitching the yeast, but before the end of primary fermentation, you pitch the malolactic bacteria. That would be considered a co-fermentation technically. But I'm sure even through the duration of this presentation, I'm probably going to use the term co-inoculation incorrectly, but just assume that it's for either or of those situations, whether you're pitching them at the same time or you're pitching them incrementally, but before the end of primary fermentation. And then, of course, the last time you can pitch it is any time after primary fermentation has ended. So this would be considered sequential malolactic fermentation. There is no one size fits all for any of these. There's advantages and disadvantages to either strategy. So let's look at co-inoculation or co-fermentation first. The documented advantages are typically that the bacteria can get better acclimated to the product because they prefer the lower alcohol. You're kind of introducing the rising alcohol to them over time, which allows them to become better acclimated to that environment. There is some evidence that having these co-inoculations with the wine yeast actually increases fruit flavor intensity. So this has been, of interest to regions that may struggle with intense fruit flavors in their wines. From a practical standpoint, it helps minimize the spoilage risk because there is no downtime here. It is you pitch both of your yeast and your bacteria at the same time or pretty close to each other. And so you never have a moment where something isn't happening in that wine in which a spoilage microorganism can really outcompete the proliferant fermentation at that time. You are basically controlling the fact that these two microorganisms are going to dominate both of your fermentations. And then when they're completed their task, you can stabilize the wine and reduce that potential downtime where you don't have any SO2 production or your wine is too warm and it allows for the proliferation of acetic acid bacteria, anything like that. The other nice practical part of this is that it can decrease the total fermentation production time. So instead of having, in a sequential situation where you first go through primary, then you do some racking, and then you do your malolactic fermentation, which could take, depending on your yeast and your processing techniques, could take a month to 2 months on average to complete that process. You can basically create that down to about, a 10 to 14 day period. And so this allows for better, tank movement, moving wine through inventory and all that kind of stuff. The disadvantage to this, however, is that there has been some research that shows that the malolactic bacteria can be antagonistic towards the yeast growth, which causes stuck primary fermentations. I would say if you're worried about that, I would reach out to your supplier and ask them for compatible yeast and bacteria strains because that's been more heavily studied and more heavily investigated by the suppliers at this point compared to some of the older research literature. There was also this potential risk of acetic acid production. There's a lot of different reasons behind why that could be, but I would say it's not consistent in terms of whether or not you're going to end up with that situation. The bigger risk is really this potential red color intensity loss because essentially, if I've already stated, the longer duration of malolactic fermentation helps enhance your red color stability, helps enhance that red color intensity, then obviously if you shorten that time period, you do run this risk. So we looked at this while I was at Penn State a few years ago, and we looked at it in one of our hybrids, Chamberson. The reason being because hybrid production is pretty proliferant here. These are kind of our cash cows, I guess, of the wine industry. They don't tend to be the wines that are going to sell or retail for over $30 a bottle, but they do tend to sell by volume. And so we were looking at this one variety in particular and hope that co-inoculation or co-fermentation really would help retain some aromatic freshness and potentially enhance fruity aromas because this variety isn't really known for its great pop of fruit. It's a little bit more earthy. And so we wanted to see if this would influence that flavor profile at all. The other thing we were looking at was to reduce acidity because this hybrid variety can be neglected in the vineyard. It has a tendency to retain its acidity. And so we were looking at malolactic fermentation in this case, and specifically co-fermentation as a potential way to see if we could reduce more acidity in this variety compared to a sequential inoculation. And then finally, because this is typically used as more of your, common table wine in a, $10 to $18 price point, was there a way that we could reduce processing time and make this variety more profitable for those that were pretty heavily producing this variety? And so this is a large, actually looks a lot better now on my screen that I have it blowed up, but this is a large summary of our analytical data. We did look at must post-primary fermentation and post-malolactic fermentation chemistry time points. And I'm going to pull these apart for you just a little bit more on the next slide here. So this is looking more specifically just at post-primary fermentation. And what you'll find is there really isn't any big significant difference in these chemistry time points with exception to the malic acid concentration. So you can see that in our sequential inoculation, this had not yet been inoculated with malolactic fermentation and it had significantly more malic acid compared to the co-inoculation treatment. There is another significant difference, which was the alcohol, but it was only off by 0.3 at that point. So we didn't really consider that a treatment effect that time. But of course, if we looked post-malolactic fermentation, so when the sequential inoculation was done, the malic acid concentration actually came out the same. So we didn't see, one method better represented in terms of reducing more malic acid than the other. It just took a little bit of a longer time period for the sequential fermentation to complete. And that's what this graph is showing here. You can see processing time at the bottom of your screen, and then the concentration of malic acids on the right. And then we also tracked the population of Enococcus, which is on the left and is represented by the lines with circles. But if you look at, you can see for malic acid concentration for the co-fermentation, co-inoculation, we considered those done at day 14. For the sequential, it took 18 days. So there really wasn't that big of a difference in our research trials in terms of production time. However, what isn't shown here is a series of commercial trials that we did with 2 local wineries using the same strains and the same variety. And what they found with their co-fermentation and co-inoculation trials was they were actually able to reduce the production time. So from the start of primary fermentation to the end of malolactic fermentation, they were able to reduce that in some of those wine trials by 11 days. So that's almost a 2-week time period, 2-week difference, which could have logistical implications for a winery. So if we switch gears then and look at sequential fermentation, so this would be primary plus malolactic fermentation. Again, advantages and disadvantages. The advantages are this is fairly consistent. It's a consistent process. You complete primary, you do some racking, and then you start malolactic fermentation. And because of that consistency, you also get pretty consistent flavor development. It's a little bit of maybe a stylistic rut in some ways. Actually, I have that listed as a disadvantage here because of the consistency. But if your goal is to create a product that consumers can depend on and have some sort of consistency in it, then this obviously may be a really good choice for that wine style. The other advantage is that you can control the percent of malic acid that's converted. So what do I mean by that? What I mean here is you can inoculate for malolactic fermentation and physically make the decision on when you want to stop it. So you can do part malolactic fermentation by inhibiting the growth of the bacteria at a certain point, or you can allow for the total depletion of malic acid. So it's really just up to you. The disadvantages, again, you get this stylistic consistency. Of course, we still have that contribution to red wine color loss, and there is also this increased spoilage risk. The unfortunate part about sequential malolactic and after primary fermentation is the fact that once winemakers tend to get to this point where they inoculate for malolactic fermentation, then it's kind of like, all right, I got through the thick of harvest, I'm done for a while. And sometimes those tanks or barrels can get forgotten for quite some time. And if we don't stay on top of it daily, it's very possible for spoilage to occur not only during the downtime between primary malolactic fermentation, but also during the malolactic fermentation process as well. That's especially important if you are doing really, really long malolactic fermentations. It takes some control and monitoring by the winemaking team to ensure that you're not getting that spoilage. So if we look at red wine color loss, there has been 2 different solutions in terms of how to better enhance red wine color stability. Of course, the first one is micro-ox. And I would say for both of these solutions that I'm going to give you, solutions or tools, I guess tools would be the better word, these don't come with this will work 100% of the time guarantee. It just, like everything else in winemaking, there is no guarantee. It's always going to depend on the wine chemistry, how the product is used, and also really the technology application itself. So both of them, really the theory around the enhancement of color stability is through ultimately increasing the concentration of acetaldehyde. So that may give you a little red flag because acetaldehyde is related to wine oxidation. But in this case, we get some acetaldehyde development through primary fermentation, and that acetaldehyde is actually pretty important in red wine color stability processing. It's the chemical link that creates a bridge between, the unstable red pigments to forming these more stable red pigments, the ones that aren't influenced by an SO2 addition. And so with with controlled dosage rates of oxygen, you do get some um, uh, small acetaldehyde development, and the hope is that that acetaldehyde development will then be utilized for this red wine color stability process. Now, of course, there's problems with this theory. When I was at Penn State, we looked at a bunch of different wines that were generally low in anthocyanin concentrations. And so if you don't have a high anthocyanin concentration to start, there's no way that adding micro-ox or using micro-ox at that point is going to help give you a more intense red wine color after you employ this process. You have to have all of the different chemical components there, probably in order for this to work. There's other components that you need: the acetaldehyde, the tannins, and of course the anthocyanins to make those stable chemical structures. The other tool would be a delayed MLF or a prolonged MLF. And again, James Osborne in Oregon looked at this, and from their research in Pinot Noir, they determined that it took 200 days post primary fermentation before the malolactic fermentation wines were of equal color intensity to non-malolactic fermented wines. So they had to wait 200 days before going through malolactic fermentation in order to end up with that same color intensity. From a practical standpoint, that's obviously very challenging. That's half a year, a little more than half a year. You run the risk of microbial spoilage through that whole time. And in the background, you just have to realize that the reason why that delay was so long is because this red wine stability process, it's very, very slow. It's a very slow chemical reaction at our typical cellar temperature of 55 degrees Fahrenheit. If you're dealing with hybrids, this is just kind of a note to say that you may get some different effects from malolactic fermentation because hybrid varieties tend to have a slightly different chemistry than our vinifera cousins. So in this case, I see malolactic fermentation being used primarily and foremost as an acid management tool. Again, this is probably because most of the hybrids I'm working with here in the East and Midwest tend to have higher acidity retention coming in from the vineyard. However, when using malolactic fermentation and really thinking about what strains to use or going through native malolactic fermentation, it can add some complexity to these wines that may otherwise be a little bit more consistent or stylistically boring in some cases. The one downside to this is color problems. Because they have a different chemistry, the way that their color is going to stabilize may require a little bit more thought and extra steps in the winery, especially going through this malolactic fermentation process. If we look at white wines or hard ciders, you can use malolactic fermentation here in a number of different ways as well. So for white wines, this can definitely be an acid management solution. But you can also do some pretty fun things here in doing partial malolactic fermentations or separating lots and having one group go through malolactic fermentation and then experimenting with blending. The other fun thing with this is, of course, flavor alteration. So Chardonnay is typically the variety where we want that buttery flavor. But you can do different degrees of buttery. And like I said at the beginning of the presentation, different lactic acid bacteria strains may have secondary flavor alterations as well. So you may get some strains that have different emphasis on fruit or even vegetative kind of aromas. And so you can really create some complexity by mixing up your malolactic fermentation strategy in white wines in general. If you're doing ciders or apple wine, the important thing to think or remember here is that your primary acid, unlike wine grapes, is malic acid. And so if you inoculate for malolactic fermentation, theoretically you can deplete all of your malic acid, which may not create a very desirable cider. In grape wine, our primary acid is tartaric acid. So even if we go through malolactic fermentation, we still have another acid to depend on. But with ciders, your primary acid is malic. And so this does take some more control, especially if you want to do partial malolactic fermentation, which you can do from a cider stylistic standpoint. This is definitely something that you can do because it does contribute different flavors and mouthfeel effects to cider as well. And then the one thing I would say that's important is if you are doing malolactic fermentation with a cider and you are blending, you always want to make sure that you have properly sterile filtered the cider that underwent malolactic fermentation to physically remove the bacteria before adding it to a cider that may have more malic acid in it and that has not undergone that malolactic fermentation. And that's pretty much for obvious reasons. You don't want another malolactic fermentation to happen once you blend those two products together. So just a few takeaways about malolactic fermentation. The first is there's lots of different bacteria strains that can contribute to malolactic fermentation. They all fall in that lactic acid bacteria group. Malolactic fermentation is a winemaker's stylistic choice. So, there's no right or wrong way to do this. It's really up to what the winemaker wants to do. And of course, there's probably some practical reasoning behind their decision. It's important to be aware of the potential color losses in reds, and I also wrote rosé wines here for obvious reasons because it still will have that pink color contribution that can be influenced by the pH changes and also the malolactic bacteria. Co-fermentation or co-inoculation can help reduce production time. So if this is something that your winery is struggling with during harvest, if you need better efficiency and better logistics for holding different grape lots or wines that are coming into the winery, then this may be something that can help fix that problem. Monitoring MLF progression is important. The reason for this is because you may not know when the product is stuck. And I definitely worked with wineries that have gone through following by paper chromatography, which is great. It gives you a really great image. But having that final analytical contribution can really tell you whether or not your wine has completed malolactic fermentation and can help avoid those potential re-fermentation problems once the wine is bottled. So monitoring is important for that, but also for monitoring spoilage through the malolactic fermentation process. And then, of course, once your malolactic fermentation process is completed, it's a really great idea to go ahead and stabilize that wine with proper temperature control, ideally, or at the very least, getting the proper amount of sulfur dioxide in the wine to reduce any potential spoilage after that process is complete. So that's all I have for you guys today, and I think that gives us about 12 minutes for questions, which I'm happy to answer for anybody. On this slide here, this is my current contact information. I do a little bit of education. I guess it's bi-monthly now. If you're interested in some of the content I put out, you can use that website address at the top of your screen, dgwinemaking.com. And you're more than welcome to sign up for that. I also do education a lot right now through Instagram. So my Instagram handle is there. If you're looking for more news-oriented information, I put most of that on Facebook. So you're welcome to use any of those extra sites for future correspondence. And of course, my email's there if you ever have questions.
Denise, I don't know if you see the questions. We have a question. What are some of the factors that can influence volatile acidity production by LAB?
That's a good question. So again, this is going to be a it depends situation. So some strains of lactic acid bacteria, especially if you're doing native or spontaneous malolactic fermentations. Some of them are more prone to producing volatile phenols than other. It was for volatile phenols, right? That's what you asked.
Volatile acidity.
Or volatile acidity. Okay, so some strains, even in this case as well, some strains will create ethyl acetate or even acetic acid just as part of their natural state of growth and as part of the byproduct development. So in addition to other flavor compounds they may produce, they also produce these off flavors, I guess, in our case. Sometimes though too, that volatile acidity increase is not so much from the strain itself, but more from probably a stressful situation that's going on in the wine. So I typically saw a higher rate of volatile acidity production during or by the end of malolactic fermentation in regions that had higher alcohols and lower general pHs, so hotter climate regions, which may be pertinent to those of you in Texas. The reason for that is probably because not so much of the malolactic bacteria itself, but probably because of competing microorganisms in the wine, typically acetic acid bacteria. A lot of times when I saw these higher incidence rates as well, the malolactic fermentation would have stalled, but the winemaker didn't know until we did some analytical testing and maybe looking under a microscope and seeing that there was populations of acetic acid bacteria as well. So there's two different ways. You can get this from certain strains. We see it more common in native and spontaneous malolactic fermentations, but there could also be competition from spoilage bacteria, spoilage yeast, really too, and not having good sufficient growth of your malolactic bacteria when you're trying to go through malolactic fermentation.
I have another question. What are all the ways to stop malolactic fermentation?
All the ways. So to stop it, if you're already going through it, the best thing you can do is rack the wine, sterile filter, chill, and add sulfur dioxide. And I would do all of those things to get it to stop. You will see some depletion of malic acid as you go through that process until the wine is completely void of the microorganism. But yeah, that's what I would do.
Okay, and I think this next question is related to the previous one. I am told that high SO2 levels prevent malolactic fermentation. Nonetheless, in the early spring, I typically find that barrel bungs pop out during the night, dance around on the floor, and then hide in inconspicuous locations. I would love a 100% way to inhibit malolactic fermentation.
So that was a great image. I can see the bung dancing on the floor. So yeah, so high SO2 levels will definitely inhibit your malolactic fermentation. It's one of those environmental factors that influences the bacteria greatly. Actually, they're very sensitive to sulfur dioxide. However, there's a caveat to that. Of course, you have to have a high enough free SO2 based on your pH. So if you have a high pH wine, 3.8, 3.7, something like that, you obviously need a lot of sulfur dioxide in order to inhibit the bacteria from growing. Another caveat to that solution is the temperature. So if you add SO2 and you have the wine in a relatively warm storage area, warm being 60 degrees and above, then your SO2 gets depleted, your free SO2 will get depleted, and obviously you don't have that inhibition effect anymore. That would help delay or inhibit your malolactic fermentation. So I guess to be more specific towards your own strategy, we'd have to kind of look at the situation and say, why is it that you're getting this to occur, and look at some of those environmental conditions. I'm pretty sure that something else other people will occasionally suggest is the use of lysozyme, I think. I'd have to double check that, but I think lysozyme addition can also help inhibit malolactic fermentation. I'm actually a little worried of saying that because I know this is getting recorded and I won't get a chance to double check. But that would be something to ask your suppliers as well if the lysozyme addition could be helpful in that case. And there are some rules around lysozyme additions as well.
Next question. Would you recommend adding malolactic bacteria and nutrients prophylactically or only for stuck malolactic fermentations?
Oh, that's a good question. I will say that in general, I don't usually recommend adding malolactic bacteria nutrients. However, I have seen the argument made for those additions regardless of the situation. So the reason why I don't tend to make those additions is because I deal right now with a lot of clients that deal with high nutrient contents in their ferments to begin with high yams, basically. And so my general assumption is that there's plenty of nutrient left over by the end of that fermentation that the malolactic bacteria can utilize. And to be fair, in most of those cases that I'm working with, most of them do not have any issues completing malolactic fermentation. So that would be the first thing I would tell you. Are you first having trouble with malolactic fermentation? If you are, it's just a good question. It really depends. I don't really just throw in nutrients just for the fun of it because there are some potential downsides to doing that. And when you add the nutrient at that stage, it's now there and available for anything in addition to your malolactic bacteria. Now, if you are stuck and you run some analytical testing and it's obvious that you're depleted in nutrient, then yes, you should add nutrients. And actually, that is recommended before you would add more malolactic bacteria. I know the tendency is to add more malolactic bacteria in a stuck condition. It doesn't work and it's not recommended. Most of what's recommended is temperature first and then looking at your nutrient content. So I guess that was a long-winded way of saying no, I don't just add it prophylactically, I add it when needed.
I have a question.
Sure.
In Texas, we have many situations when we have a low acidity and high pH wines. Do you recommend putting those red wines through malolactic fermentation at all?
Do they have high malic acid content?
I'm not sure. I don't think so. From what I've seen so far, I wouldn't say that they do, no.
Yeah, we see, it's funny because so I work out of Pennsylvania and I read all the time how high our malic acid concentrations are here, but when we actually go ahead and test specifically, the fruit, the juice, must, whatever, for malic acid, we are really not that high in malic acid concentration. And so I would say in that case, it really, again, it depends on the style of wine you're going to create. If you feel like you can taste it and it's causing a problem in the style of the wine you want to produce, then malolactic is still probably an option for you. But if you don't taste it, or if it's producing the type of style that you want without going through malolactic fermentation, then I wouldn't feel bad about not going through malolactic fermentation. So this is a very personal choice. It's going to be, what is the final style of wine that you want from your product? And then second to that is, can you control the stability of the product if you don't go through malolactic fermentation? Because while most of the people I work with, when they bring me a re-fermented wine, they almost always tell me it's because there's sugar in the wine and it's re-fermenting through primary fermentation. And I've tracked it, and 9 out of 10 times, it's actually a malolactic fermentation that is taken off in the bottle. So I think it's important to be realistic with yourself in terms of how well your post-bottle stability is, what the duration of that bottle is supposed to be, the shelf life of that bottle is supposed to be, and then assessing the risk from there. From a stylistic standpoint, do you need it? Maybe not, but you have this secondary stability consideration that I would definitely look at realistically.
Yeah, it seems to me it's a tricky decision to make because you have
Sure.
high pH wines to begin with, which are not very stable to begin with.
Right.
You run the risk of increasing that pH even further with malolactic
Absolutely.
fermentation, which makes them even more unstable. But if you don't, they're going to be unstable. be,
It
so,
and that's what I dealt with when I was living in California. We dealt with a similar, people malolactic fermentation was always stuck. I feel like that was one of the number one things I was working on, and probably related to the same things: the high alcohol, the low acidity, the high pH, and then just the absolute ability for acetic acid bacteria to thrive in that situation and cause a lot of spoilage. Um, but I would say most people that I worked with out there, they were going through malolactic fermentation. I just don't always think it's necessary.
mhm,
And actually, I'm hoping that's a good question I'll probably ask at the upcoming ASED Eastern Conference because we're actually talking about these high pH situations
that's right,
and,
yes.
yeah, the acid chemistry and
Mhm,
what to consider for that.
mhm.
Mm,
And my final question was you mentioned long lasting malolactic fermentations, slow and long. What are some steps that winemakers can take to make sure that their wine is safe during those um, long fermentations? And what should they look for?
yeah, this takes some experience. It takes some it definitely takes some comfort and or being comfortable in
Mm-hmm.
knowing that things could go south quickly. But it also takes some patience.
Right.
But in general, I would say the people I know that are doing this, they have a really good control over their environmental temperature. That's a big one. And they're constantly monitoring their barrels because most of the time when I see this, it's with wine in barrels, and so that routine visitation to the wine, checking it, keeping it topped up, keeping the temperature at a place where it needs to be to reduce spoilage. It's important. Not just tasting the barrels, but also testing those barrels analytically when you have things that are going through 1 or 2 year time frames of finishing malolactic fermentation. Um, yeah, it's that general quality control, like making sure you're taking the right analytical tests and tasting the wines to ensure that they're not on their way to spoilage.
Mm. We have another question from one of the attendees. Is there a lot of bubbles made while CO2 is released?
Yeah, sure. So it's smaller. It's you can actually see this. I may have a video of it somewhere. I may post it up on social media. You can see when you inoculate for malolactic fermentation in like a glass carboy or a glass, whatever. You can see these little bubbles coming up and popping at the surface of the wine. So there is a definitely a good amount of CO2 production, but it's not as heavy as what you'll see during primary fermentation. Um, However, if it's in bottle and the malolactic fermentation has taken over, it can create enough CO2 to pop the cork of the bottle. So, and actually, in some of those cases I was talking about earlier, some of them were from consumers that had left their bottle on their shelf somewhere and it pops one day in their house and it isolated malolactic fermentation taking place. So it can create enough CO2 intensity to do that. It's just when you see it in production, you're not going to see it to the degree that you would see the bubble formation during primary fermentation. They're smaller little bubbles.
All right.
Some winemakers claim, I don't claim this, but I've heard winemakers claim that they can go up to a barrel and hear the bubbles popping when it's going through malolactic fermentation.
Huh.
So if you can do that, please let me know. I haven't been able to do that yet, but that's what I hear.
All right. Do we have any more questions at this time? Any more questions? No? Okay, well, before we end, I would like to ask all the attendees today to please take a minute at the end of this event to fill out the survey. It shouldn't take more than a minute, and it's really helpful. And I choose many of the topics for my webinars from these surveys that you fill out. So please do take a minute to do that. Thank you very much, Denise, for this presentation. It was really, really interesting. A lot of good information. I'm sure that everybody felt the same way about this. And I'm looking forward to seeing everybody next time. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate everyone's time.
Have a good day.
You too.